All right, good morning once again. If you would open your Bible to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. This morning we're going to be in verses 9 to 21. Last week we looked at the first 8 verses of Daniel. We just started a new series through the book of Daniel. So if you weren't here last week, we've only made it 8 verses in. And this morning we're going to finish chapter 1. The title of the sermon this morning is The Lord Gives Favor and Wisdom. The Lord gives favor and wisdom. So let's read the text, open us in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into the sermon this morning. Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 9. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths whom eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. If you will pray with me. God, I pray this morning as we look at this text and we see, God, that you are faithful. You are faithful to give us favor. You are faithful to give us wisdom, Lord, especially in the moments when we need it most. And as these men desperately needed favor and they needed compassion and wisdom, Lord, you were faithful to give it. Help us to see, God, that you have not changed. That you are the same God today. And that when we desperately need favor, when we desperately need compassion and wisdom, you will be faithful to give it. For that is who you are. I pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Let me give the context of where we are at in the book of Daniel. We've only made it 8 verses, but I need to give the context because we're jumping into the middle of the story here this morning. Last week, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar is king of Babylon, and he has decided to besiege Judah. He attacks Judah, and the Lord gives Judah into his hand. Nebuchadnezzar takes some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brings them back to Babylon, and he places them in the temple of his God. He then decides to weaken Judah's forces by bringing some of the royal family and the nobility back to serve in the Babylonian courts. He tells his chief eunuchs he wants them to find some youths. He gives them 6 qualifications. They need to be young, blemish-free, handsome, wise, intelligent, and competent. Now, there are 4 men, at least 4, maybe there was more, Judean men who meet these qualifications. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, in order for these 4 men to serve in the Babylonian king's courts, they need to do 2 things. Number 1, they need to be educated for 3 years in the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And number 2, they need to eat the royal food and drink the royal wine so they can keep up their appearance. Now, Daniel did not protest the first of these. He had no problem, as far as we know, learning the language of the Chaldeans and learning the literature of the Chaldeans, even being given a Babylonian name. But he does protest the second. The text says that Daniel was resolved not to defile himself with the king's food and the king's wine. Now, last week I gave 6 possibilities for why eating the food and drinking the wine may have defiled him. And you can go back and listen to that online if you'd like. And so Daniel asked the chief of the eunuchs, he says, will you give us permission to give me permission to not defile myself? And this morning, we're going to see what was Ashpenaz's. Ashpenaz is the chief of the eunuchs. We're going to see what his response is. So let's look at verse 9. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. For the second time in this chapter, we see God giving. If you remember last week, God gave Daniel into the hands of Babylon. And we now see God giving favor and compassion to Daniel while he is in Babylon. This word for favor is the Hebrew word chesed. It's normally translated love. It usually refers to the covenantal love of God. We see this pattern in Scripture where God likes to put his people in unfavorable circumstances and then give them favor in those circumstances. We see that over and over again. When Joseph was in Egypt, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, hesed, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison, Genesis 39. When the Israelites were leaving Egypt, the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have whatever they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now think about that. When they were leaving, they would go ask their fellow Egyptian, like, hey, can I have that necklace? Sure, take it. And they plundered them. When Esther was in Persia, the young woman pleased him and won his favor, the king, chesed. Not only did God give Daniel favor, but he also gave him compassion, normally translated mercy. The psalmist writes, he also made them objects of compassion in the presence of all their captors, Psalm 106:46. Now the chief of the eunuchs, he could say to Daniel, you don't want to defile yourself? That's your problem. It's not my problem. But Daniel is shown favor and compassion by God. Look at verse 10. And and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Now, just because God gives favor and compassion doesn't mean that life is easy and automatic. Ashpenaz knows how things work. To reject the king's food and to reject the king's wine is to reject the king. And to reject the king is to get your life rejected. And not just Daniel's life. Ashpenaz has been charged by the king, and so he is therefore responsible for making sure this edict is seen through. It's interesting that Ashpenaz says, I fear my lord the king. Because I imagine Daniel was thinking the exact same thing. So do I. I fear my Lord, capital L-O-R-D, and my King, capital K-I-N-G. Now, Ashpenaz assumes that if these 4 youth don't eat the royal food and they don't drink the royal wine, but they're all going to look drastically different than all the other youth. And when they come before the king is surely going to notice this. He's like, the king's going to see that the ones I was in charge of, they look worse, and that's going to come back on me. Ashpenaz is afraid of going from castration to decapitation. Now, at this point, Daniel could give up. But Daniel is resolved to not defile himself. So resolved that he speaks up not only once, but twice. Look at verse 11 and 12. Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Daniel decides to speak up to the steward. Who is this steward? This steward is like a guard or an overseer. Ashpenaz has assigned a steward over these 4 youths. Now, whether he knows about this conversation or not is not clear. Whether Ashpenaz knows that Daniel's speaking to the steward, it's not really clear. Daniel asks the steward, he says, listen, here's an idea. Test your servants for 10 days. Essentially, run a trial. Notice the noun, notice the number of this noun of servant. It's plural, meaning all 4 of us. I wonder, did the other 3 tell Daniel they wanted to join him in this test? Like when Daniel says, test all of us, and they're like, wait, what? Like, you're including us in this? I was looking forward to the food. What we know of them later in the book, it would seem that they wanted to join Daniel in this test. Now here's the test. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Now last week, if you were wondering, why are there 6 different possibilities for how the king's food and the king's wine would defile him? Like, why is there 6 different possibilities of this? It's because there's some mystery here. Here's some of the mystery. Number 1, if it's because the king's food was offered to idols and they don't want to eat it because it's been offered to idols, that would be true of the vegetables as well. They wouldn't just offer the meat to idols, they would also offer the vegetables to idols. So if that's what would defile them, it doesn't make sense why the vegetables would be defiled too. 2, there is nothing in the Torah that forbids wine unless you take the Nazirite vow. Now maybe you did take a Nazirite vow, but we don't know that, and so it's perplexing. Why does he also ask for water? There's nothing in God's word that says that you can't drink wine. So we don't know. That's why there's 6 possibilities. My theory is that it's some combination of the 6. There's not one reason alone as to why this food and this wine would defile them. Daniel asks for vegetables to eat. Now, vegetables here would include any plant growing from seeds. That's how the Hebrew word literally translates. Any plant growing from seeds. So this would include fruits, grains, beans, lentils, peas, would include all that. So it wouldn't just strictly be vegetables. It would be basically any plant that grows from seeds. Let's look at verse 13 to 14. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. Daniel says, run this test for 10 days. Now, we don't know why it was 10. Why isn't it 20? Why isn't it 30? Why isn't it 2? We don't know. He says 10 days. Then bring all the youths together and line us up. At the end of 10 days, after everybody else has eaten the king's royal food and royal wine, and after we've eaten only vegetables and drinking only water, line us up and you be the judge. Compare our appearance with everybody else's. And you decide. Now, the steward agrees to run the test. I found it interesting. One commentator wrote that the steward may have agreed to the test because he would have swapped the 4 men's royal food with his diet of vegetables and water. Remember like in elementary school lunch, you go to lunch table and you trade your fruit roll-up for your rice cake or whatever, and you're like, yes, that kid always trades me his fruit roll-up for this rice cake. This is the greatest lunch food swap of all time. Now, that may be true. That may be true. We don't know. That may be true. But we know that God is working behind the scenes. The steward is under no obligation to run this test. He does not have to run this test. He could tell Daniel straight up, listen, that's not my problem. You don't want to defile yourself? My job is to make sure you look healthy before the king. Eat the food. But the steward agrees to run it. Why? Because God gave Daniel favor and compassion. Look at verse 15 to 16. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now, it's the moment of truth. 10 days is up. At the end of the 10 days, these 4 Hebrew youth are better in appearance and they are fatter in flesh than all the youth who ate the king's food. Now remember, they're already good looking. And now they're even better looking after these 10 days. The text says they were fatter in flesh. Now, why is that praise? Why is fat here is probably better translated as healthier. It literally translates as fatter in flesh, but our context would mean healthier or more well-nourished. Why? In the 21st century West, fat is a sign of being unhealthy. But in the ancient Near East, being fat was a sign of being healthy, right? You had to have some money to not just be like skinny, like malnourished skinny. And so for them, fat was healthy. It's kind of like you ever see a baby, right? You ever see like a really fat baby? That's how you know babies are healthy. They're fat, right? Now we have to ask a question. How could 4 youth who eat nothing but vegetables and drink nothing but water, how could they look better than those who eat the finest food in the land and drink the finest wine? Is this just good nutrition? Or is this a miracle? You be the judge. I don't know. Now, like all tests, the proof is in the pudding, or in this case, the vegetables. So the steward took away their royal food, took away their wine, and gave them only vegetables to drink and vegetables to eat and water to drink. Let's look at verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. We now see, for the 3rd time in this chapter, God giving. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Babylon. God gave Daniel favor and compassion. And now God gave these 4 youths learning and skill in all literature and all wisdom. This term learning basically means knowledge. And this term skill basically means wisdom or insight. So God gave these 4 youths knowledge and insight into all wisdom, into all literature. In addition, God also gives Daniel something extra. God gave him understanding in all visions and dreams. This gift from God will come up multiple times in this book. Now, we're not told why God gave Daniel only the ability to interpret dreams, right? He didn't give the other 3. He just gave it to Daniel. We're not told why. The only answer we could probably come up with is what Paul reminds us, that all gifts are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills. 1 Corinthians 12:11. The Spirit decides who to give what gift to. God gave visions to Nathan, to Isaiah, to Obadiah, to Nahum, to Habakkuk, and he also is going to give visions to Daniel. A vision is essentially a revelation. It's a communication from God to be communicated to others with the focus on the visual aspects of the communication. God also gave dreams. He gave dreams to Abimelech, to Jacob, to Laban, Joseph, Pharaoh, Midianite soldiers, Solomon, and he also is going to give dreams to Nebuchadnezzar that we'll see next week. A dream is also a revelation, a communication from God to make something known, which may include verbal, rational communication as well as images. When the text says that Daniel had understanding about this, it means that God has given Daniel the ability to interpret and correctly apply visions and dreams. Now think about that. You imagine like if I was like you could bring me your dreams and I could tell you what they mean. That'd be pretty cool. Look at verse 18, 19. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them was none found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. So the narrator says, at the end of the time, this is the end of the 3 years of education, i.e. indoctrination. The king Nebuchadnezzar, he summons his servants. Ashpenaz brings in all the youths. He lines them up, and Nebuchadnezzar speaks with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were all head and shoulders above the rest. Now, why was none found like them? Because God gave them knowledge and insight. Therefore, they stood before the king, which NASB translates this, so they entered the king's personal service. They are going to be in the king's personal service. Do you see a man skillful in his work? He will stand before kings. Proverbs 22:29. Look at verse 20. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. In every matter, not just some matters, in every matter, Nebuchadnezzar found them 10 times better than all of his magicians, all of his enchanters in his kingdom. Now, keep in mind, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is massive. It pretty much includes all of the Middle East at this time. And these four youth, they're probably like 17 years old. These four youth are the wisest men in all of the land. Nobody compares to them. They are better than all the Babylonian magicians. This word is only used, this word for magician, it's only used in Egypt and in Babylon. What is a magician? It's not the way we think of magicians. It's a soothsayer priest. It's a class of persons in the Levant that interpret dreams and omens as well as perform seemingly supernatural acts. This is probably who the Magos are, what we call the Magi, who are visited by baby Jesus. Right? We often think with those Magi who came that they were like just wise men. They were sorcerers. Which is all the more miraculous that perhaps they get saved. Perhaps. They are better than the Babylonian enchanters. What is enchanter? The literal translation of this is snake charmer. This term is only used in Daniel. It means a conjurer. It's a class of persons in the profession of sorcery and magical arts, possibly necromancy and communication with the dead. That's what Babylon prided themselves on, was enchanters and magicians and soothsayers. And these four youth are 10 times better than everybody in the land. Nobody compares to them. Look at verse 21. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, how long is that? Daniel went to Babylon in 605 BC. Cyrus's first year was 539 BC. So if you do the math, Daniel was in Babylon for 66 years. This would line up with him being about 14 years old when he went there. That would put him at 80 when Cyrus comes. Can you imagine being in exile for 66 years? That's a long time. Is Daniel going to return home with the exiles when Cyrus sends them home? We'll have to wait and see. Here's what we do know. Daniel outlasts six Babylonian kings. Nebuchadnezzar will come and go. Evil Merodach will come and go. Nergal-Sharezer will come and go. Labishai-Marduk will come and go. Nabonidus will come and go. And Belshazzar will come and go. And Daniel is still there. Because his God is still there. We'll stop there with our exposition. Application of the text. I have 5 truths for us this morning. I have 5 truths about God from this text. Here they are. Number 1, the same God who gives us over to Babylon is the same God who gives us favor and wisdom in Babylon. The same God who gives us over to Babylon is the same God who gives us favor and wisdom in Babylon. I find it interesting that God is mentioned 3 times in this chapter, and all 3 times he is mentioned doing the exact same thing, giving. Verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Verse 9, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. You know, what struck me about this is that the same God who gave Daniel and his 3 friends into the hands of Babylon is the same God who also gives them favor and wisdom in Babylon. It was God's hand that lifted them up and transported them into Babylon, but it was that same hand that also gave them wisdom and favor while in Babylon. It was God's hand that drove his people into the desert. But it was that same hand that fed them with water from the rock and manna from heaven. It was God's hand that allowed Jezebel to threaten Elijah's life, driving him into the desert. But it was that same hand that fed him with ravens. Listen to me. God's hand may drive you to a breakup, to a loss of a job, to a sickness, to infertility, to a rejection letter, to any number of Babylons in your life. A feeling of exile. A feeling of being forgotten by God. But the same hand that gives us over to Babylon is the same hand that gives us favor and wisdom in Babylon. God's hand will never bring you to a desert without that same hand drawing from a very deep well. 2. When God provides speed bumps, they are neither roadblocks nor raceways, but resolutions and reminders. When God provides speed bumps, they are neither roadblocks nor raceways, but resolutions and reminders. Daniel had resolved to not defile himself with the king's food. He was so resolved that he spoke up and asked the chief of the eunuchs. He says, Ashpenaz, hey, can you please let us not defile ourselves? And the narrator tells us that God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Now, when I read that, I don't know about you, but when I read that, I thought, oh wow, Ashpenaz is going to grant his request. But Ashpenaz says, hey, Daniel, listen, brother, I love you, man, but not as much as I love my head. God gave Daniel favor and compassion, but God also gave him a speed bump. Ashpenaz says no. He says no. Now, in this moment, this speed bump could become one of 2 things. A, it could be a roadblock. Daniel says, I guess Ashpenaz said no. I guess that's it. I guess we have to eat the royal food and drink the wine. I asked. It could be a raceway. Daniel could go out in a blaze of glory. I don't care what you say, Ashpenaz. I'm not eating that food. I'm not drinking that wine. But Daniel doesn't do either of those. He is not only resolved to defile himself, he is also resolved to trust God to provide a way. He does not get discouraged and defeated at Ashpenaz's response. He does not get bitter and belligerent at Ashpenaz's response. He chooses to trust that God will provide a way. I find that often God will give us speed bumps in life. And those speed bumps can easily become roadblocks, where like the slightest bit of resistance causes us to give up or give in. You ever like go over a speed bump and you like slow down all the way and you get to there and you're like, your car's like, You're like, oh, I guess let's just go home. Those speed bumps can easily become a raceway too, where you see it and you feel the need to hit the gas. Let's get over this thing, where we feel the need to take decisive action. Listen, if I'm going to make it over this bump, I've got to do something. But I find that speed bumps in life are neither roadblocks nor are they raceways. What are they? They are an opportunity to be resolved and to remember. Remember what? Remember that it is not Daniel who is making this happen. It is God. God will provide a way. Don't give up, Christian. Don't give in. And don't go full speed ahead. Be resolved to trust that God will provide a way. He will. 3, when the people of God step out in faith, the God of his people proves faithful in their steps. When the people of God step out in faith, the God of his people proves faithful in their steps. I think one of the reasons I wanted to go through the book of Daniel was because I was reading through it in my quiet time about a year ago. It might have been 18 months ago. I can't remember. And I was struck with awe by the faith that Daniel and his 3 friends had. Like as I was reading through my quiet time, I'm reading, about the fiery furnace, and I'm reading about the lion's den, and I'm just like Daniel praying when he wasn't supposed to, and he's like praying right in front of the window where everybody can see him, and I'm just like, man, like gosh, how do you have that kind of faith? And I was just floored, like how did Daniel's 3 friends step out in faith with the fiery furnace? I can't imagine what it would be like to be burned to death. Sounds awful. I don't know if that, would I rather be, I think I'd rather the fiery furnace than be in a lion's den, right? Because then, that seems like a slower death. How did Daniel step out in faith with the lion's den? Where did this faith come from? I think one answer to that is this: because they saw God's faithfulness in this test. Daniel says, test your servants for 10 days. Then let our appearance of the use to eat the king's food be observed by you. And notice what Daniel says, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Now that's a bold statement, isn't it? Deal with your servants according to what you see. Now, Daniel either majored in nutrition in college, or he has tremendous faith in God. Daniel is wise enough, he is intelligent enough to know that if this test fails, you ever think about that? What if the test failed? What if they came in looking all scrawny and haggard and just, what if the test failed? One of 2 things will happen. He will either A, be forced to defile himself, or B, he'll be killed. But Daniel has faith that at the end of these 10 days, God will supply what is needed. God will make them as fat as a breastfed baby. When the people of God step out in faith, the God of his people proves faithful in their steps. Now, I see 2 extremes when it comes to faith. One is the prosperity gospel that teaches that as long as we step out in faith, God will always rescue us from the fiery furnace and save us from the lion's den. The other extreme is the doubting gospel, that even if we step out in faith, God rarely rescues us from the fiery furnace and the lion's mouth. I mean, sometimes, but like it's the exception. It's pretty rare. Daniel is neither testing God here, nor is he doubting God. He's not testing God, nor is he doubting God. He says, you, Ashpenaz or steward, test us, and then deal with us accordingly. What does that mean? It means he trusts God with the results. He says, run the test, and we'll leave it to God. Trust God with the results. Step out in faith and trust God with the results. 4. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? 1 Corinthians 4:7. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? 1 Corinthians 4:7. You know, one of the challenges of many children's Bible stories, children's Bible lessons, even pastor sermon series sometimes, maybe often these days, is that they can often revolve around the theme of emulating the faith of Daniel. Like, be like Daniel. Now, listen, I don't want to take away from that. We are told in the Bible to imitate the faith of those who have come before us. That's true. But I want us to be intentional to point out what made Daniel and his 3 friends special. It was not their intelligence or their good looks or their competency. It was not their resolve. It was not their wisdom. It was not even their faith. It was their God. It was their God. As for these 4 youth, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Nebuchadnezzar says, man, these 4 youth, they are different. There's something different about them. But Paul reminds us, for who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? Remember when Pharaoh had a dream? He said to Joseph, he pulls Joseph in, he says, hey, I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Why was none found like them? Because there is no God found like our God. 5. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. 1 Corinthians 1:25. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. 1 Corinthians 1:25. The text says that in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, all the enchanters that were in all his kingdom. Now, the Chaldeans, just like the Egyptians, they prided themselves on having wise men. They were proud at how much wisdom they had because of their magicians and their enchanters and their soothsayers. They believed that they were given secret divine knowledge of the ways of this world. And yet, even a pagan king, through common grace, was able to see that Daniel and his 3 friends, at the age of perhaps 17, were 10 times wiser than all his wise men in Babylon. How can this be? How could a 17-year-old from Judah be wiser than my lead magician who's been doing this for 50 years? How can this be? Because Paul writes, for the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. As I mentioned last week, we live in Babylon. Let's be clear about that. We don't live in Israel. We live in Babylon. We live in a culture that believes they have secret divine knowledge. They consider themselves enlightened to truth. We use all kinds of words for it. Progressive, woke, enlightened, inspired. Brothers and sisters, don't ever forget that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. Don't ever think that you are dumb or that you don't have wisdom or that others have a better handle on how to think through culture, how to think through marriage, how to think through parenting, how to think through finances, how to think through school, how to think through life. The foolishness of God is wiser than all the wisdom of men. God has placed us in Babylon. He has given us the sacred writings which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. Read this. Study it. Inhale it. Don't go without the vegetables. Eat this. You will be 10 times wiser. Not to your glory, not to us, but to your name, O Lord, give glory.